I have always believed that the most profound silence is found not in the absence of noise, but in the presence of the woods. People who do not spend time in the wilderness think of the forest as a quiet place, a sanctuary of stillness where the soul can rest. But those of us who have spent weeks at a time under the canopy know better. The forest is loud. It is a constant, churning machine of life and death. It is the sound of pine needles being crushed under the weight of a foraging squirrel, the rhythmic, hollow drumming of a pileated woodpecker seeking larvae in a dying cedar, and the rustle of the wind as it combs through the high branches like a giant, invisible hand. I have lived for those sounds for over a decade. I am a man who finds comfort in the isolation of the backcountry, someone who would rather wake up to the frost on a nylon tent than the hum of a city street. My name is Jack, and for 10 years I have considered the Black Ridge Wilderness my second home. It was supposed to be a standard 4-day loop, a chance to clear my head after a grueling quarter at the firm. I packed my marmot tungsten tent, my internal frame pack, and enough dehydrated meals to last me until Tuesday. I checked in with Sarah at the ranger station, a woman with a kind smile and a silver hoop earring who warned me about the unseasonable cold front moving in from the north. I told her I was prepared. I told her I'd seen it all before. I was wrong. The drive up to the trailhead was long and winding, the kind of road that makes you feel like you are leaving the modern world behind in layers. The asphalt turned to gravel, then to dirt, and eventually to a narrow twin track that scraped the underside of my Jeep. I parked at the edge of the clearing, took a deep breath of the sharp, pine-scented air, and began the hike. The first day was perfect. The sun filtered through the hemlocks in long, golden shafts, and the trail was soft beneath my boots. I reached my designated campsite, a small, rocky outcrop overlooking a valley, just as the light began to fail. I went through the motions of camp life with a practiced efficiency. I pitched the tent, gathered enough deadfall for a modest fire, and hung my bare canister from a sturdy branch about 50 yards away. There's a specific kind of peace that comes with sitting by a campfire alone. You become the center of a very small world, a circle of orange light that pushes back in infinite darkness. I ate my dinner, drank some lukewarm coffee, and watched the stars emerge. But as the fire began to die down into a heap of glowing ribs, the silence changed. It wasn't that the forest went quiet, it was that the forest went empty. Usually the night is filled with the calls of owls and the scurry of nocturnal rodents, but tonight it was as if every living thing within 5 miles had suddenly held its breath. I chalked it up to the cold front Sarah had mentioned. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped the tent shut, and drifted into a heavy, dreamless sleep. I woke up at exactly 2:14 a.m. I didn't wake up to a sound, I woke up to a feeling. It was that prickle on the back of the neck that tells you that you are no longer the observer, but the observed. I lay perfectly still, my eyes locked on the ceiling of the tent. That was when I heard it, a slow, deliberate zipping sound. It wasn't the door of my tent. It was my backpack, which was sitting inside the tent less than 3 inches from my head. I didn't breathe. I reached out a trembling hand, fumbled for my headlamp, and clicked it on. The main compartment of my pack was wide open. Sitting right on top of my rolled-up clothes was a small, crudely carved wooden figurine. It was shaped like a man lying in a sleeping bag. It was wearing a tiny, hand-painted version of the red flannel shirt I was currently wearing, and on the chest of the figurine, carved into the fresh, wet wood, was a single word: watching. I didn't stay in the tent. I couldn't. I scrambled out, boots unlaced, clutching my bear spray and my hunting knife. The campfire was dead. I scanned the perimeter with my headlamp, the beam cutting through the dark like a blade. Nothing, no footprints, no disturbed brush. I looked back at my bear canister. It was no longer hanging from the tree. It was sitting 20 feet away, near the edge of the drop-off. The paracord hadn't been cut. It had been untied. The knots had been meticulously undone and coiled neatly at the base of the tree. I approached the canister, my breath coming in jagged plumes of frost. I popped the lid. My food was untouched, but lying on top of the dehydrated meals was my cell phone, which I had left turned off and tucked inside my sleeping bag. I turned it on. The battery was at 1%. There was a single voice memo recorded at 1:45 a.m. I hit play. The audio was 30 seconds of pure, high definition. Breathing, my breathing, but underneath it was a soft, wet clicking sound. And then a voice. It wasn't human. It sounded like a recording of a human voice played through a broken speaker. It said, "Jack, run. It's more fun when you run." The phone died instantly. I didn't wait. I abandoned my gear and bolted for the trailhead. 3 miles of steep, switchback trails lay between me and the Jeep. I ran until my lungs burned and my vision blurred. Every time my boots hit the ground, something in the woods to my left snapped in response. It was keeping pace with me, moving through the dense timber with an ease that was terrifying. I stopped to listen, and the thing stopped too. I pivoted my light toward the noise and saw two amber eyes reflecting back at me. They were 7 feet off the ground. They didn't blink. I shouted that I had a gun, but the forest only echoed my own panic back to me. The creature began to mimic my voice, shouting my own threats back at me from 3 different directions. It was mapping my fear. I crashed through a thicket of mountain laurel and reached a rocky outcrop. I stopped to catch my breath and realized my hands were covered in a thick, black, oily sap. I looked up and saw my car keys dangling from a high branch of a pine tree in the center of the clearing. Below them, carved into the bark, was a message: "Check your pockets, Jack." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a human ear with a silver hoop earring. It was Sarah's. The clicking started again directly behind me. I turned my light and saw it. It was thin, ashen, and draped in scraps of my own tent that it had sewn into its flesh with wire. It had no ears or nose, just a wide, lipless mouth and obsidian eyes. It tilted its head and spoke in Sarah's voice, telling me she was salty. Then it began to unfold, its limbs stretching until it stood 10 feet tall. It didn't roar, it just watched me with a terrifying, intellectual curiosity. I jumped off the outcrop, falling 15 feet into the brush and twisting my ankle. I crawled into a wolf hole between two boulders, turning off my light. I heard the creature's claws dragging across the stone above me. A long, spindly finger reached into the crevice, touching my boot before retracting. Then the thing began to sing a lullaby my mother used to sing to me, getting the melody perfect but changing the words to describe how it would break my wings. It peered down through a crack. In the rocks, its face now a distorted, fleshy mask of my own features. It told me it would go home and live my life, and that my family wouldn't even know the difference. The rage finally overcame the fear. I reached into my pocket, found my emergency flare, and struck it, shoving the magnesium fire directly into the creature's face. It let out a sound I will never forget, a screech that was 1,000 voices screaming in unison. I used the distraction to roll out of the hole and slide down the embankment toward the access road. My ankle was a scream of agony, but I didn't stop. I could hear the thing behind me, no longer playing, no longer mimicking. It was angry. The sound of it crashing through the trees was like a freight train. I reached the road and saw the silhouette of my Jeep. I didn't have my keys, but I remembered the spare I had hidden in a magnetic box under the wheel well years ago. I fumbled for it, my fingers slick with blood and sap. I found the box, ripped it open, and jammed the key into the door. I threw myself inside and locked the doors just as a massive, pale hand slammed against the driver's side window. The glass spiderwebbed but didn't shatter. I turned the ignition. The engine groaned, sputtered, and died. I looked out the window and saw the creature's face pressed against the glass. It wasn't mimicking me anymore. It was just a void of black eyes and needled teeth. It began to hum the lullaby again, a low, vibrating sound that shook the entire car. I turned the key again, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. The engine roared to life. I slammed the Jeep into gear and floored it, the tires screaming on the gravel. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the creature standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't chasing me. It was just standing there, waving a long, spindly hand in a slow, mocking goodbye. I drove for 4 hours without stopping, not slowing down until I saw the first glow of a gas station on the horizon. I never went back for my gear. I never called the ranger station to check on Sarah. I knew what I would find. Now I stay in the city. I keep the lights on. But sometimes, when it's very late and the street noise dies down, I hear a soft, wet clicking sound coming from my closet. And then, in a voice that sounds exactly like mine, someone whispers, "Check your pockets, Jack." I sat in my apartment for weeks after that night, the curtains drawn and the doors triple bolted. Every time the floorboard creaked or the wind rattled the window panes, my heart would stop. I kept thinking about the ear. I kept thinking about the way that thing looked at me, as if I were a puzzle it had finally solved. The police eventually found Sarah. They found her in the ranger station, or what was left of her. They said it was a bear attack, a particularly grisly one, but they couldn't explain why her radio had been dismantled and reassembled into a shape that defied Euclidean geometry. They couldn't explain why the walls of the station were covered in carvings of a man in a red flannel shirt. I didn't tell them what I saw. Who would believe a man who claims he was hunted by a 10-foot-tall mimic made of ash and nylon? They would put me in a ward, and in a ward, you can't lock the doors from the inside. Tried to go back to work, tried to pretend that the world was still the logical, boring place I had once complained about. But the woods have a way of staying with you. I started seeing the amber reflection of eyes in the dark glass of my office windows. I started hearing the clicking in the rhythm of the rain. One night I came home to find a small wooden figurine sitting on my pillow. It was shaped like me, sitting on my sofa, clutching a glass of whiskey. On its chest was carved a new word, almost. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the night after. I realized then that the escape hadn't been an escape at all. It had been a release. The creature wasn't done with the game. It had just moved the board to a bigger forest. The city is just a different kind of wilderness, full of shadows and deep canyons of brick and steel. And as I sit here now writing this down so that someone might know the truth, I can hear the sound of a zipper. It's coming from my suitcase in the hallway. Slow, deliberate. Zip, I won't look, I won't run. I'll just wait for the clicking to start. Because I know now that once you've been watched by the silence at Black Ridge, you never truly stop being a part of it. The woods are never silent, and neither is the dark. It's always listening, it's always learning, and eventually it always finds the right frequency to call you back home. I looked at the suitcase for what felt like hours, the shadow of it stretching across the hardwood floor like a long, dark finger. The zipping sound had stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like physical. Pressure on my eardrums. I knew I should get up. I knew I should grab the heavy iron poker from the fireplace or the kitchen knife from the drawer, but my limbs felt like they were made of lead. The radiator in the corner hissed, a sound that usually brought comfort, but now it sounded like the creature's distorted breathing. I focused on my breathing, trying to keep it steady, trying to deny the thing the satisfaction of my panic. But then the clicking began. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the walls. Click, click, click. It moved with a terrifying speed, circling the room, vibrating through the plaster and the studs. It stopped directly behind my head where the sofa pressed against the wall. A voice whispered through the drywall, a perfect, chilling replica of my own mother's voice. It asked me if I was ready to come back to the trees. It told me the fire was out and the frost was coming. I closed my eyes and realized the window was open. I hadn't opened it. The cold, pine-scented air of Black Ridge began to fill the room, and I knew that no matter how many locks I turned, the forest was already inside. I felt a cold, spindly finger brush against the back of my neck, and for the first time since that night, I didn't pull away. I just sat there in the dark and waited for the broadcast to begin. The room began to fade, the walls of my apartment dissolving into the rough, silver bark of birch trees. The streetlights outside turned into the cold, uncaring glow of a hunter's moon. I wasn't in the city anymore. I was back at the outcrop, sitting by a fire that gave no heat. The creature was there, sitting across from me, its obsidian eyes reflecting the dead embers. It handed me a knife and a piece of wood. It didn't have to speak. I knew what it wanted. I began to carve. I carved a figurine of a man sitting at a desk, writing a story about a man who went camping alone. I carved the fear into the wood, the way the eyes looked in the dark, the sound of the zipper in the night. And when I was done, I looked at the creature and saw that it was no longer a monster. It was me. It wore my skin, it spoke with my voice, and it felt my heartbeat. I realized then that the only way to escape the hunter is to become the hunt. I stood up and walked into the trees, leaving the man at the desk behind. I became the click in the dark, the snap of the twig, the shadow that moves when the wind dies. Down and somewhere in a city far away, a man in a red flannel shirt is waking up in a tent, wondering why the woods have suddenly gone so very, very silent. He will find the figurine, he will hear the zipper, and the game will begin again just as it always has and just as it always will, because the forest needs a voice and I have finally learned how to scream. As I walked deeper into the thicket, the sensation of my own body began to shift. My fingers felt elongated, my joints popping with the sound of dry kindling as I moved with a newfound, jerky grace. The ground beneath my feet was no longer cold, it was a part of me. I could feel the roots of the hemlocks miles away, the frantic heartbeat of a doe in the valley, and the slow, rhythmic decay of the fallen logs. I was no longer Jack, the man who feared the dark. I was the dark itself. I looked back at the campfire one last time and saw the man I used to be. He looked small, fragile, a flicker of warmth in a universe of ice. He reached for his headlamp, his hands shaking, and I felt a surge of something that might have been pity but was more like hunger. I opened my mouth to speak, but only the sound of a high-frequency emergency tone came out. It was beautiful. It was the sound of a world without words, a world where the only logic was the hunt. I turned away from the light and faded into the pines, moving toward the edge of the wilderness where the gravel roads began. There was a hiker at the trailhead, a young woman with a bright blue pack and a map she didn't know how to read. She looked up as the wind rustled the branches above her. She didn't see me, but she felt the prickle on the back of her neck. She reached for her phone, but I had already untied the knots of her reality. I waited for her to zip her jacket. I waited for her to step into the circle of my trees, and then, in a voice that sounded exactly like her father's, I whispered the only thing she needed to hear: "Welcome home." The transition was complete. The city, the firm, the whiskey, they were all just static now, fading echoes of a life that had been too loud and too shallow. Out here there is only the frequency. The way the light hits the moss at dawn, the way the snow muffles the sound of a breaking bone, the way the silence stretches until it snaps. I have found my place in the architecture of the ridge. I am the shadow that waits in the wolf hole, the click that haunts the camper's dreams, the architect of a better, colder cage. People still come here, of course. They come with their expensive gear and their false sense of security, thinking they can tame the wild with a GPS and a flare gun. They don't understand that the wild doesn't want to be tamed, it wants to be heard, and I am its voice. I spend my nights weaving nylon into my skin and carving truth into the trees. Sometimes I find a phone that still has a charge, and I record the sound of the wind or the sound of a heart stopping, and I leave it for the next one to find. It's a courtesy, a way of letting them know that they aren't alone. Not really. I'm always watching. I'm always waiting. And when the moon is high and the fire is low, I'll be there just outside the light, waiting for the zipper to move. Because the most profound silence isn't the absence of noise, it's the sound of me finally being home. And I am never, ever leaving again.